The following is an excerpt from a longer interview with the great-granddaughter of Henry Morgenthau, who was the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during the Armenian Genocide.
How does approaching the subject of the Armenian Genocide and this narrative that you construct in your book by looking at events in the Ottoman Empire and also in the Russian Empire, where there was also a very significant Armenian population, and bringing it to about the present day, right? What does psychology help us better understand in a way that perhaps history or political science is not as well prepared to, or maybe not well prepared, but
Right. The
differently?
effects, the symptoms of trauma experience, whether they're at the level of the individual or the collective level, and I go through a lot of both in my book, are present, and that's what's left out of these other disciplines. But in the book, I do try to link it to the history. I first try to show all the different collective traumas that there were between the two groups, because there were one at least imposed by Armenians on the Azeris, not on the Turks. And I try also to show, and this is to me very important, that but in both in the South Caucasus, where the Armenians and Azerbaijanis are fighting now, 100 years ago, each of those groups very much wanted the same thing. They wanted a right to live their lives expressing their identities in peace. And they each wanted some autonomy within the Russian Empire, as it was before the Russians were taken over by the Soviets and dropped out of the war. And that's before the Turks entered the South Caucasus in order to gain more territory, if possible, without any Armenians in it, or at least without any Armenian community strength in it. So, as well as showing the negative impacts of traumatic experience historically, I also spend a certain amount of time showing the commonalities in aims the two groups had for their futures as peoples. And I mention certain individuals who had a better perception of what could be that was positive between them. And I thought to myself, well, what really makes sense would be to be able to free themselves from either Russian control or Turkish control, because the two empires that are no longer in existence are, have been taken over by Russians and Turks who continue to push the people in the South Caucasus around. But it seems to me that if the people in the South Caucasus got together, as they once briefly did in 1918, and formed a greater union among themselves, they could do quite a lot. Now, I know in a way that sounds pie in the sky, but it is also an old idea. And I personally would advocate for a process going forward in which, and this is my last chapter of the book, I spend a lot of time describing large group events at the unofficial level of thoughtful individuals who would like peace in both societies to be carefully conducted. Now, this is impossible in Azerbaijan because you can't speak openly safely at the moment, but they might make a space for it. And I don't know how popular it would be in Armenia either. I don't know how able people in Armenia are today to question anything about the government's stance and the mobilization for survival, which is completely understandable. But we have to continue to go on thinking, and it seems to me that there are other possibilities.
Could we maybe just backtrack a little bit to the subject of the genocide? When we had Ron Sunni on our show about a week ago, he made a very interesting remark when he was talking about his book that appeared in 2015, The History on the Armenian Genocide, which was titled They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else. And what he was trying to do in his book was not so much, of course, not so much, but he was, of course, not trying to justify what the Committee of Union and Progress leadership did in 1915 as to understand why they did it, why they carried out the Armenian Genocide. And I thought one of your chapters in your book approaches this subject in a way which I don't think many historians on the Armenian Genocide have done it, in the way that you look at the personal lives of these very men who implemented the genocide. Talat, who was the Ottoman interior minister and then the Grand Vizier during the war, Enver Pasha, who was the war minister, Dr. Nazim, who was an ideologue of the Committee of Union and Progress. Why did you feel that focusing on their backgrounds was important and worthy of including within your larger narrative of your book?
Okay. Well, because I was fascinated to find out that each of these 5 men had experienced some major trauma in relation to the decline or disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and that they were furious about it. They cared tremendously about preserving the empire. And I also, as Armin knows, give a certain amount of credibility to the idea that they were very unwilling to give up their high status as Ottomans. And that I think but that's a very grown-up pursuit. Young people think less of status in that way. And these people just wanted vengeance after their traumas, or sometime. They each experienced trauma at a different age in their lives. So, but the most out front about the desire for vengeance was Ismail Enver, who was the Minister of War, and he presided over the retaking of Edirne, right?
He was definitely one of the main military commanders in 1913.
Yeah. Right.
The Second Balkan War.
Second Balkan War. And he gave a speech about the Christian slaves that, he spoke in the most derogatory terms and with contempt over the Christians who had dared to take his land and that he could take it back from them. And he was for vengeance, vengeance, vengeance. He wrote that in a letter to his fiancée. So, but I think they were all shaped by their traumatic experience. And of course, completely unaware of it as such, unaware of the impulse that resulted from it for vengeance. Sorry, yeah.
And of course, the denial that the Turkish state has actively promoted ever really since its founding in 1923 carries this outsized effect we're now seeing in political matters relating to the domestic population of Turkey today, and also as we're seeing with Turkey's support of Azerbaijan during this conflict, is being interpreted by many Armenians as almost a continuation of genocide, and hence to your point of how this kind of trauma, having not been properly reconciled, rears its head even years now, almost more than a century since the commission of the genocide.
But let me say, if I said this already, please stop me. But, Turkey denies the genocide. They spew nasty things about Armenians. I mean, they say horrible things about Armenians. They show contempt and so on. Well, and they're coming with weapons into the South Caucasus. They did their best to prevent the formation of an Armenian state. It was a miracle that the Armenians were able to establish a republic in 1918. And the Turks have never been happy about it, and they still talk about purifying the region for themselves, for Muslims. So I ask you as an analogy to imagine, what if Germany had not been forced, did I mention this already? Been
I don't think
forced
so.
to admit they committed the crimes of the genocide. What if they had continued to deny it? Would Jews feel safe if Germans were bringing weapons into the Middle East anywhere near them? I mean, if you don't disavow a war aim, which was to empty the South Caucasus of Armenians, seems to me that it would be extremely frightening and threatening.
And this also brings up another question that I wanted to ask, and this was inspired by some of these articles and op-eds that I've been reading in the news over the last 2-3 weeks since this war began. In the early 1990s, there was common reference to ancient hatreds being the cause of these very violent scenes in places like in Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia was breaking up apart as a state, as well as in Nagorno-Karabakh. And historians, especially today and in past years, have always cautioned us to avoid using that phrase. I thought, is it possible to maybe break down it itself, or is there something a little bit more to it when we look at it when we look at the history of the last 100 years? And of course, we can look at, let's say, economic and structural reasons as trying to explain why the violence, for example, in Yugoslavia assumed the forms that it did 25, 30 years ago. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, can we link trauma to traumatic events from a century ago to what is taking place now, and be able to not necessarily attribute it to ancient hatred, but unreconciled emotions and fears that are still alive to this day? I think we've been talking about in length at this point, but if we can elaborate on it.
I can't. I mean, I think you said it. I do. I don't know that situation intimately at all, but it certainly sounds like that. The less you get to know people, the more you mistrust, and they say bad things about you, the more you mistrust them, of course, and they threaten you, and that produces very bad feeling and continued threats. And it's somehow, we haven't figured this one out in terms of how we bring up children. So there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can ask a question that is somewhat related to it. Can you describe, or coming from the perspective of psychologists, can trauma be passed down from one generation to another on a collective level?
I would call it cultural transmission. It goes individual to individual, but it also gets into the culture. So it will be culturally transmitted in literature and in politics, in all parts of life. It's always there. It pervades everything. Everything has that aspect.
Right. As you mentioned, those mediums can be the perfect ways of disseminating certain thoughts or feelings, and
yeah, and that conditions people to think in a certain way. When you're young, you take it from the elders you respect, your parents and people in your community, and if that's what they teach you, you pick it up. Now, there is some clarity, which I'm not up to speed on, about physiological transmission, genetic transmission. And I gather it has some reality to it. I'm not up to speed.
Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell. It'll notify you when we post videos. Also, if you thought this was interesting, please share this video.